Let's get your fusion kit installed. You can start by opening up the blaster and removing everything that isn't the mag release. If you're installing the full-length breech, then grab a thin tool sturdy enough to handle some tapping, line it up with the pin in the breech, and take something solid to tap the pin out. You don't need to be overly forceful, just take your time and it'll work its way out. Once enough is poked out the other side, you can take some pliers and pull it all the way out. You can now separate the sled from the breech, set the stock breech aside, and grab the full-length breech from your fusion kit. Fit the notch on the breech into the slot in the sled, line up the holes, and slide the pin back in, using something to lightly tap it all the way in until flush again. If you're using the short dart breech, then you can completely set aside the stock breech components, grab the half dart breech, sled, a small O-ring, and pin provided in the kit, and assemble the breech in the same manner as with the full-length breech shown previously, taking the additional step of sliding the O-ring into the groove on the front of the breech. Now you can grab the plunger tube, collar, plunger rod, and 2 large O-rings. Take one large O-ring and stretch it over the lip on the larger side of the collar, letting it rest inside that lip of the collar. Do the same with the other large O-ring and plunger rod. With that done, take the plunger tube and do a quick inspection of it to ensure there's no debris or extruding pieces on the edges. There shouldn't be an issue here, but it's always worth checking. And if you want to go an extra step further, you can take something like a flathead screwdriver and run it around the inside edges just to make sure it's all smooth. From here, it's time to pull out the grease and lube up these components. You can break the seal on the grease by pressing the reverse end of the cap against the seal. Take a small amount of the grease and apply it around the O-rings on the breech, plunger rod, and collar. You can also take any remaining on your finger or applicator after that and apply a light layer on the inside of the collar and around the front O-ring on the breech. The final location to apply grease is inside both ends of the plunger tube. Put roughly a pea-sized amount inside both ends and spread it around about an inch deep all the way around. With all the components greased, it's time to take the collar and plunger tube and seat the O-ring side inside the plunger tube. If you see the O-ring poking out of one side, it's likely shifted and you should pull it out and reseat it completely until it's flush with the plunger tube. Now take the plunger rod, insert it into the plunger tube, and use it to spread the grease all along the inside of the plunger tube. Set these all aside on a paper towel or similar so the grease doesn't pick up any debris before going into the blaster. Next, you'll want to get the shell prepped for the new components. On each side of the shell where the plunger tube rests, you'll find a small rubber piece that supports the plunger tube. If you're planning on going higher than the included 7 kg spring or want extra shell support, pull these pieces out. If you aren't going to go higher than the 7 kilograms, then you're alright to leave them in. Next is a step that will only be applicable if you have a brand new Retaliator, as the mold has changed recently from older versions. You'll notice on each side this wide flat extrusion on the top side of the plunger tube area and some thin ribs on the bottom. You'll need to remove the top flat extrusion and snip down the bottom rib shown here down to where the angle ends on both sides. This will allow the plunger tube to fit properly in the new shell mold. Again, if you have an older version Retaliator, this shouldn't be an issue for you. If you're going to install the rubber support braces, you'll put them in now. So grab the corresponding braces for either the Retaliator or Recon Mark II, and you'll notice a slit on each of them on the larger side of the brace. Remember those small pieces you took out of the shell earlier? That slit should fit over that slot and let your braces sit flush with the shell to hold the plunger tube. From here, things will start to fall into place quickly. Grab your chamber and barrel assembly and slot that in over the pegs to hold it in place. Slip the breech and sled into the plunger tube through the collar and drop them into place, making sure that the peg on the sliding prime fits into the slot on the sled. The sled also has a track that the bottom lips should fit into to ensure it's properly aligned and slides smoothly. The narrow part of the plunger tube collar should be resting on the lifted part of the rubber brace. Slide the breech back to easily put your jam door back on, then slide it back into a closed position. Take the plunger rod and slip it into the plunger tube from the back. Now grab the metal trigger that's appropriate for the shell you're using, the catch, and the small springs for bolt. You can fit springs on these pieces by pressing and twisting until they slide over the notch and secure into place. Also make sure that, especially for the catch, you have the springs seated nice and vertically and not angled. With those ready, you can drop the trigger and trigger spring into place, followed by the catch and catch spring. If your shell is oriented as shown in the video while reassembling, the catch spring should face further away from you as you put it back in. You may need to lift the plunger tube slightly to make it easier to seat properly, but once you have it in, make sure the spring isn't bent, as that can negatively impact the catch. If you take a couple fingers and hold things in place, you can pull the trigger to ensure that the catch is releasing properly at this point. Once you verify that, you can then slide the mainspring into place over the plunger rod. Don't try and push it in all the way just yet though. Take the other side of the shell and line everything back up, making sure that the priming slide on the top is aligned to slot the peg into the bolt sled that you did the same for on the other side earlier. With that, you can press the shell down gently, and if you feel any resistance, don't force it. Check again to make sure nothing is popped out of place. If everything still looks good, with the shell still partially closed, try taking a screwdriver and nudging the catch towards the plunger tube. Sometimes it can take a little extra push to get it to fully seat properly. Once you feel things snap into place the way they should, you can screw the shell together, put the back cap on and screw it in as well. Test prime it to ensure it catches. Make sure you can deprime it by holding onto the priming slide firmly while the breech is open, and pull the trigger, slowly allowing the breech to close rather than harshly dry firing. Now drop a mag in it and check performance. If you encounter any issues, open the blaster back up and make sure nothing is out of place. And if everything looks good, contact support to get help with your kit. With that, you should have an upgraded classic blaster ready for games on the field.